Let's look at a very important topic, which is adjective clause and adjective clause reduction. We use it in the spoken language and written language too. So let's look at this topic, what it means and how we can learn it very effectively. Okay, adjective clause is a sort of clause which describes a noun. Like it adds more information about the certain noun which is used with it. And secondly, adjective clause is often introduced with relative pronouns. These are the certain relative pronouns which often introduce an adjective clause, like who, which, that, and whom. Most importantly, who is used for telling or adding more information about a certain person. For example, if you're adding more information about a certain person, so for that you would use a relative pronoun who in the subject clause, and you would use whom to add more information about that certain person in the object clause. We would know how adjective clause works as a subject clause and how it works as an object clause. Apart from that, that is sort of neutral relative pronoun which is used for both things and people. At the end, which is more specifically used for things. For example, if you're adding more information about a certain thing, you would use which and then you would add more information about that. Okay, we would know secondly, an adjective clause has a subject. The subject is often the relative pronoun itself, and there is a verb. For example, the verb could be any man verb like go, come, sleep, and eat, and it could be any sort of auxiliary verb like is, am, are, was, were, like that. Now let's look at the next, what it further tells. Okay, let's look at the example. We would know how adjective clause is used here in this example. I traveled in a rickshaw, which was very troubling, and you could use that too. As I mentioned you, which is used for things and who is used for people, and we can use that for both things and people. Now I have given you the option of both here in this example, and you would see rickshaw is a noun and which is being could say explained with a sort of clause which is adjective clause, like which was very troubling. This is what. Now let's look at the next. Okay, let's look at the example of subject clause. Subject clause is a clause like which is a clause which introduces directly the subjective sort of noun itself, and as it is here, and which is often introduced with relative pronoun who, which, and that. Okay, now let's look at the example. The man who sells ben kebabs is very famous. Now you would see here the man himself is being explained straightforward in the example, and which is the clause which is telling more about the man is introduced with who, and we would know it is a subject clause. This is the first symbol of knowing it. And secondly, sells ben kebabs is very famous. This is the additional information about this man. Now let's look at the object clause, what object clause is. Okay, let's just look at the example of object clause, like how adjective clause works as the object clause. And here is the example. As I mentioned you before, object clause like adjective clause as object clause is often introduced with relative pronoun whom and that. Whom is often used for person, that is used for things, and person for both. Okay, here is an example. For object clause, we would be very aware that object clause is a sort of clause. I means when adjective clause works as an object clause, it would be a sort of clause which would be like objective in a sense, like it would not be straightforward sentence which would be a direct information about that subjective sort of clause, like means the noun which is subjectively being acted and having information about itself or himself. It's not like that. Means the nature of the sentence, the information is like objective. Now you could see the kebabs that we ate were full of spices. Here the subject we is not mentioned in a sort of subjective sense in the early sentence, though it is mentioned as objective in the additional part, in the extra information, and the whole information is about the kebabs, and which is very objective. Okay, so the information which is being described about the noun kebab, it is objective in sense, and we used that just because of kebabs, because it is not person. But if it should be a person, for example, the driver or the rider whom we went with was very nice. So here you would see the driver whom we went with, so the person we are talking about is now objective, because we are directly talking about the rider, we are not talking about ourselves directly. That's why it is an object object adjective clause. Now let's look at the next part, what it describes further. Okay, let's guys look at the ELL errors, like how English language learners make mistakes in learning this topic. There are major three mistakes which we often commit in learning this topic, in using this topic, especially in our spoken or in our written work. And the most important thing is that we should know that relative clauses, like means adjective clauses, are often introduced with relative pronouns, which I mentioned earlier. So if you would not choose them, you would not be able to use adjective clause properly. For example, if I want to say the biryani seller sells like delicious biryani, so it's not an adjective clause, because the things you're trying to say is not being additional about the subject itself. Though if you would like to be very proper in it, so you would address it this way, like the biryani seller who sells biryani. So now who sells biryani, it is an additional information. This is an adjective clause because I used a relative pronoun to make it suitable and to make it additional about the seller. Similar cases, it means the next example here is the use of like extra use of pronouns. For example, the man whom we spoke to him. Now again we are reiterating the same person pronoun in the adjective clause, so this is sort of an error, so we should avoid it. For example, you would just use it as an additional clause. For example, there would be the relative pronoun and there would be the verb itself, then after you would not use any extra pronoun or noun within that adjective clause, within that additional information. If you would do that, this would be an error in your conversation. So let's look at it. How would it be possible? For example, the man whom we spoke to is very good, so you would not reiterate the same pronoun in the adjective clause. Thirdly, here the misuse of relative pronouns. As I mentioned you, relative pronouns like who is used for people, which is used for person, that is used for both thing and people, whom is used for people. So this is the distinction we should know them. For example, the samosas who are delicious, so this is not going to make a good sense because samosas cannot be persons. So samosa is a sort of a thing, so for that you would use which, like the samosas which are delicious. So now it is correct. Now let's look at the next, what it describes for. Okay, let's just look at the reduced adjective clause, like how adjective clause could be reduced. Why we use a reduced adjective clause if there is adjective clause itself? So we use a reduced adjective clause to shorten the form of adjective clause, which is very big in itself, and secondly to improve our fluency, to be very fluent, and thirdly to improve our means to make concise our speaking, to make concise our conversation, to speak very to the point and to speak very shorter. That's the point. Now let's look at it further. Okay, let's look at it. Look at the process of reducing the adjective clause. Firstly, we should be conscious that we often use this process. This is the first process where we remove subject and the be verb. Be verb could be any is, am, are, was, were, and it could be an auxiliary verb too. So we would reduce them with the subject. The subject itself is the relative pronoun, which we studied before. So we would remove them, and we would could say use the rest part of the sentence close to the other part. So this would be reduced form. And this is the first part. Here you could see this stall that is on the right side of cross road is expensive. So here you would see that after subject, that, and be verb is, there is the could say prepositional phrase. So for this you would just remove this part and you would close it to the other part of it, and this would be the reduced adjective clause. Like this stall on the right side of crossroad is expensive. Now the adjective clause is reduced. Now it is known as reduced adjective clause. Now let's look at. Okay, now it's the next part of the same, like you would remove the subject, relative pronouns, and the be verb. Like how would you reduce and make the sentence, the adjective clause shorter? You would remove this part. Okay, so you would say the shrine that is located. Instead of saying that is located, you would directly say the shrine located at the corner of etc. So you would add the rest part of it. This would be shorter form because you reduced this form. This made it shorter. Secondly, the women who are weaving. So for this you would not say this part because you would remove this part. This is the subject, this is the be verb, Now it is an auxiliary verb here. So the women who are weaving, instead of saying this, you would say the women weaving handcrafts or etc. So this would be the shorter form of this sentence because you removed it and you made it shorter. Now let's look at the next part of it. Okay dears, let's look at it. I've brought Balochi language with comparison to English, like how Balochi language speakers, like Balochi people, how would they be able to learn adjective clause reduction in English. So let's look at some parameters in both of the languages. In Balochi language, the position of putting or placing adjective clause is same, like it is not different. And secondly, in Balochi there is no relative pronouns. We don't have any relative pronouns, though we use glottal stops, which we are going to discuss further in the topic. And secondly, in Balochi language, for example, if there is no any relative pronoun, how would it be possible to reduce the adjective clauses? So reducing adjective clauses in Balochi language is impossible. And fourthly, there is a big difference of structural sentence structure and word order difference in Balochi language, like how English sentences and word order is. It is quite different than Balochi language, and both of them are very different from each other. Okay, so because of these parameters, a Balochi language speaker would be very struggling in learning English, especially adjective clause in English language learning. Now let's look at an example of it. Okay dears, let's look at the comparison of Balochi and Balochi and English. Now here is an English clause. The man who is selling chana chaat is very polite. Now in this example you would see the adjective clause very nicely, and the same is here, but the difference is because of their structure, the parameters that we studied before. In Balochi you would see chana chaate baha kanage and Ahmad sak washin. So here you would see we are talking about the person, and here this is not any sort of relative pronoun. This is a glottal stop, so that we use and then we say the further sentence here. So because of such glottal stops, it is very difficult for I could say Balochi speakers who try to learn English, and especially adjective clause there. So the parameters make it very difficult for learners. Now let's look at the next. Okay yes, let's look at this example. This is an example of a reduced adjective clause. How reduced adjective clause has an impact and how it is different in Balochi language clauses. Okay, so reduced adjective clause is quite difficult because it creates too much glottal stop with comparison to the adjective clause itself. Adjective clause does not create any glottal stop, does not create too much glottal stop in Balochi language adjective clauses, though reduced adjective clause creates too much over there. Because and it is very funny over here, you would see the form that we are trying to be very fluent is going to be very difficult in Balochi language with comparison to its complex form, like adjective clause, adjective clause. Yeah. Okay, the teacher teaching Urdu is not conducting the class. So this is the form which is very fluent in English, but it is going to be very difficult in Balochi language, and it is being very complex and very lengthy instead of being short. Okay, you would see too much glottal stops here in this reduced form. Okay, Urdu e wani nage start classa naziri. So here two glottal stops. In the adjective clause we had just one glottal stop, but in the reduced form we had two glottal stops. So it is not just with this clause, it is the same case with the other clauses too, and there we have the same sort of too much glottal stops. So this is what that creates a big difficulty for the learners of Balochi who are trying to learn English, especially adjective clauses and reduced adjective clauses. Thank you.